history to see how they were growing. When would enough be enough, and the people figure out that Mao was not the leader they thought he was? Benfu could see it, but were he and his father the only ones in millions? He shook his head and tried to shake the stench from his nostrils. Outside he could hear the work groups coming in from the fields, some trying valiantly to lead the others in a weak rendition of "The East is Red," a song to exalt their glorious leader, the only semblance of music allowed. When those in the group had left that morning, their voices were stronger, ready to take on the challenge of meeting their ever-rising quota of gathering more vegetables, planting more rows, watering more crops. Now, with the way all farmers were brought together to work toward one goal, many of them failed to see the irony that they were doing more work for less personal gain. Land that had been in families for generations was now owned and controlled by the government, and the people were poorer than ever. With the failure of the Great Leap Forward, the commune system was being reorganized, but not fast enough. Benfu had kept quiet about it as long as he could, but when he'd finally exploded with frustration, his sarcastic remarks had gotten him in trouble. He'd been called in to speak to the elders, and he'd thought he'd settled them down enough. What he hadn't known at the time was his outburst had caused an investigation into his background, and they'd discovered he wasn't who he'd said he was. He'd immediately been accused of hiding the truth about his family line. It had only gotten worse from there because he'd refused to give up his parents' names. After he had spent a few days locked in a small room off the commune kitchen, they'd moved him to the outhouse to try to break him. He had to admit they'd come close when the sun was at its highest and the temperature in the metal privy had soared. As his head pounded and he sweat out the remaining moisture in his body, the flies and mosquitoes never let up from their relentless attack. With his hands tied, Benfu was helpless to fend against them or the stench of human excrement that filled his nostrils and mouth. To keep his sanity, he recited his favorite poem over and over, allowing his mind to focus on the words of long-gone poets rather than on the squalor around him. The dragon sighs, the fine rains fall. He paced as the whisper of his words punctured the silence of the small enclosure. The dragon was the heat, and he sincerely wished that fine rains would come and the roof would open so he could lift his face to the sky and take in mouthfuls of sweet water. Twice already earlier in the day, before and after beatings, the commune leader had come to the shed to ask Benfu if he was ready to cooperate. Simple, he'd said. Just tell him his parents' names and address, and Benfu could go back to work with the others. Benfu knew if he did, his mother and father would be persecuted. They'd sent him to what they thought was a safe place to hide from the Red Guards, who were so vehemently against those with undesirable family backgrounds, black families, as they called them, teachers, landowners, business owners. In this tumultuous time, if a person didn't have ties to officials who could protect him, any sort of success or title gained in life could be their downfall, branding them as a counter-revolutionary. Benfu wouldn't put his parents in danger by revealing their identity. But he wasn't the only one in the commune who came from a black background. There were landowners' family members as well as other people who'd come from some sort of undesirable line. The difference was that they had not tried to hide it, and they gladly attended re-education classes and renounced their family members, declaring to forever ban them from their lives, a last resort to find their way back in the good graces of Mao and his followers and avoid persecution. Benfu backed up gingerly and sat on the makeshift shelf over one of the deep holes. It was ironic that he was in misery from holding his bowels, but was imprisoned in an outhouse. Only twice that day had someone come to unfasten his belt and allow him to relieve himself, ignoring his shame as they stood over him and watched as his dehydrated body expelled nothing but black waste. Only once had they sent a frightened young woman in with a cup of warm water to ease his swollen throat and cracked lips. He'd begged her to help him, to give him more water or bring him a ball of rice, but the girl had scampered away like a scared rabbit, too afraid to jeopardize her own freedom. He couldn't blame her. She was just a small peasant girl and would have never been able to